She was barely awake, her head resting against the cool window of row 12. The hum of the airplane engines vibrating softly through the cabin, when a voice shattered the fragile calm. "Is there any pilot on board?" It wasn't the usual captain's calm announcement. It was sharp, urgent, almost trembling. Panic rippled through the rows in a way that made every stomach churn. Passengers stirred, eyes darting around, some clutching their armrests, others freezing in disbelief. The young woman in the red dress blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what she had just heard, the sudden responsibility settling over her like a physical weight. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe because stories like this deserve to be heard. Her pulse quickened, and she realized she was staring straight at the captain, a man whose composure had clearly crumbled, his hands pressed against his face, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the pale daylight streaming through the windows. Around her, the cabin felt like it had shrunk, the air thick with tension, every whisper, every cough magnified. She wasn't trained for this, she was just a passenger. A young woman with an ordinary life behind her, but something primal stirred in her. An instinct, a small voice that refused to be ignored. The plane shuddered slightly, and she could feel it, not the mechanical vibration, but the collective fear, the realization that the flight crew was suddenly helpless. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a clarity forming, a strange, sudden courage that made her lift her gaze and focus on the aisles, the captain, the blurred faces of other passengers. She didn't know what she could do, but she knew she couldn't just sit there. The moment was raw, and time stretched, seconds turning into eternities as eyes turned toward her, and she felt, for the first time, that she was the one everyone would be looking to. The young woman, whose name she barely remembered as it had been buried under a week of exhaustion, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the red fabric of her dress catching on the edge of the armrest. Her mind raced as she tried to remember anything from the brief flight safety course she had once half listened to. But panic was a cunning thief, stealing the clarity she so desperately needed. Around her, murmurs turned into anxious whispers, and then into outright questioning, the tension in the cabin thickening with each heartbeat. She glanced toward the front, where the captain, a man of authority and control mere moments ago, was now a figure of visible distress, hands trembling as he fumbled with the microphone, unable to stabilize his own voice. Flight attendants hurried up and down the aisle, their usual calm replaced by the same dread that gripped every passenger. She could feel their eyes flicking to her, a silent plea, as if the universe had chosen her to bridge the impossible gap between chaos and order. Her stomach twisted, but a strange focus settled over her mind. She took a deep breath, remembering a snippet of logic drilled into her during safety demonstrations. Stay calm, assess, communicate. The cabin seemed to sense the shift, the tension rippling outward, people leaning slightly forward in their seats, waiting for someone to act. She realized, almost shockingly, that she didn't have to be a trained pilot to make a difference in this instant. Awareness and action were sometimes enough to save lives. Her hands shook, but her voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the murmurs with a quiet determination. "I can help," she said, words barely audible, but enough to make the captain lift his head, eyes wide and searching. There was a pause, a long, suspended breath as everyone waited, and then something clicked. She wasn't invisible. She mattered, and in that realization, the underdog's courage began to take root, fragile but undeniable, a spark that promised possibility even amidst overwhelming fear. Every instinct screamed at her to remain seated, to pretend this was just a nightmare, that someone else would step forward. But the glances of the captain, desperate and raw, refused to let her hide. She moved quickly, almost mechanically, toward the cockpit door, the red of her dress vivid against the soft blue of the seats, a streak of resolve in a sea of panic. Passengers recoiled slightly, some whispering her name as if trying to anchor themselves to reality, and she felt the weight of every eye, every unspoken question. The captain's voice, previously a pillar of authority, was now broken, fragmented by uncertainty and fear, and she realized that the power dynamics of the cabin had inverted in an instant. Authority was no longer measured by stripes on sleeves, but by the courage to act. She fumbled briefly with the communication panel, recalling words from emergency protocols she had never imagined using, her hands trembling, mind racing, yet clarity edged through the terror. "I've never flown a plane, but I can follow instructions," she said, directing her words to the captain, the crew, anyone who would listen. The stewardess, recognizing both the panic and the potential, nodded sharply, stepping aside to give her space. Around her, the passengers had quieted, leaning into the hope that someone, anyone, might restore order. And for the first time since the announcement, there was a fragile sense of possibility. The young woman's thoughts turned inward as she processed the absurdity and enormity of the moment. A simple flight had become a crucible, forcing her to confront fear, responsibility, and the limits of human resilience. Each instruction from the captain was precise yet strained, and as she followed them, a rhythm emerged, a tentative coordination that hinted at survival. Her fear never vanished, but it became a fuel, sharpening her focus, forging a connection between every passenger and crew member that transcended ordinary boundaries. The plane was not just a machine. It was a test of trust, courage, and the quiet heroism of someone who had never sought it. And as the minutes stretched, the young woman in row 12 realized that being ordinary didn't preclude extraordinary action. It was in these moments, raw and unguarded, that real heroism could take root. The cockpit door closed behind her with a definitive click that seemed louder than anything else in the cabin, and for a moment the world narrowed to the small space, the blinking lights, and the trembling hands of the captain as he gestured for her to take the controls. Her heart hammered in her chest, a wild rhythm that matched the low drone of the engines, and she could feel every passenger on board leaning, invisibly, into her courage, their lives silently tethered to her next move. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her, and instead focused on the instructions the captain barked with a mix of desperation and relief. Each word a lifeline she clung to. "Follow my lead," he said, his voice still quivering, and she nodded, fingers hovering over switches and levers she had never imagined touching with such stakes. Time slowed, each second stretching into an eternity as she adjusted controls under the captain's careful guidance, listening to the engine tones, watching the instruments, feeling the subtle shifts of the plane beneath her hands as though the metal itself was alive, responding to her resolve. Sweat pricked her brow, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts as the gravity of the situation pressed down on her. And yet, with each successful adjustment, a strange calm began to grow, an almost meditative clarity cutting through the fear. She thought of her life before this, the ordinary routines, the quiet moments she had taken for granted, and the stark contrast of now how quickly everything could change, how suddenly one person could become the fulcrum of hope. The captain's eyes never left her, searching for mistakes, signaling corrections, but also slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to trust her, to let go of some control in order to let survival steer the course. The turbulence hit, shaking the plane, sending a collective shiver through everyone inside, and she tightened her grip, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Passengers whispered prayers, some crying silently, some gripping their neighbors' hands, and she felt their energy, a current of collective faith that pulsed through her veins, fueling decisions that mere training could never teach. The realization struck her with an almost shocking clarity. This was not just about flying a plane. It was about connection, about trust, about rising to a moment larger than herself. And in that awareness, the boundaries of fear began to blur, replaced with a fierce determination. Minutes felt like hours, every instruction executed under the weight of responsibility. But gradually, the shaking of the plane eased, instruments stabilized, and a cautious optimism began to bloom in the captain's eyes, mirrored by the tentative relief she sensed behind the cockpit door. For the first time, she felt the possibility of control, of agency, of hope, and with it came a quiet pride, not loud or boastful, but steady, resilient, like a small flame burning stubbornly against the darkness. And as she glanced at the instruments, then up at the captain who now nodded at her with something almost like respect, she understood that she had crossed an invisible threshold. There was no going back to being just a passenger. She had become the pivot upon which survival rested, and with that realization came a new weight, a solemn understanding that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, and that the smallest actions, taken in moments of unimaginable pressure, could ripple outward to touch lives in ways she had never imagined. The plane had settled into a steadier rhythm, the violent shudders of earlier replaced by a cautious, measured hum, but the tension inside the cabin remained taut, like a held breath that refused to leave the lungs. She stayed at the controls under the captain's careful guidance, every adjustment deliberate, every movement weighted with responsibility, and as the minutes passed, she could feel a subtle shift not just in the aircraft, but in herself, in the way fear had transformed into clarity, urgency into focus, helplessness into action. The captain finally exhaled audibly, shoulders slumping for the first time in what felt like hours, and yet his eyes never left her, a silent acknowledgement that she had become more than anyone could have anticipated, a young woman in a red dress who had stepped into a storm no one expected her to face. Outside the window, sunlight began to break through the clouds, scattering gold across the wing, and in that light, the chaos of the cabin seemed almost distant, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be clarity, guidance, and hope. Passengers began to relax incrementally, some whispering words of thanks, some tears glistening in relief, and she felt an almost overwhelming wave of empathy and connection, understanding in a visceral way that courage was not measured in accolades or recognition but in the quiet, persistent choice to act when no one else could. She thought of her own life, her doubts, her fears, the countless times she had hesitated before, and realized that those moments were practice for the small steps that had, unknowingly, built the foundation for extraordinary action. The captain spoke then, voice steadier, filled with a mix of gratitude and astonishment. You saved us all." And she shook her head slightly, a humble smile forming despite the exhaustion, knowing the truth. It had not been a single hero, but the willingness to listen, to act, to trust, that had made the difference. The stewardesses moved with renewed energy, reassuring passengers, distributing water, calming voices that still trembled, and she stepped back, allowing the professionals to take over while she simply breathed, letting the adrenaline fade, letting reality seep in. Outside, the horizon stretched wide, infinite and calm, and in that moment, she felt something settle deep inside her, a quiet pride that was not loud or boastful, but firm, lasting, an awareness that even ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. As the plane prepared to land, she sat back in her seat, the red dress slightly wrinkled, hair tucked, face still tense but softened by relief, and she realized that life had handed her a rare gift, a test of courage and resilience that had revealed not just what she could do in crisis, but what humanity could achieve when fear was met with action and panic with clarity. The passengers clapped softly as the wheels touched the runway, a ripple of gratitude that was as much for her as for the crew, and she allowed herself a small, quiet smile, knowing that this moment would linger long after the engines had stopped humming, long after the lights dimmed, long after she returned to the ordinary rhythms of life. And in that lingering calm, she wanted to leave one thought, one message for anyone watching this story. Courage does not require perfection. Heroism does not require a title. And every small choice to act with empathy, clarity, and resolve can change the world around you in ways you may never fully see. From which part of the country are you watching this story?